of the good things happen. So if 3 loans can take place instead of 2, that's better. Because more companies get started, more people get employment, they get economic inclusion, more taxes get generated for the public sector, which in turn then can provide public goods and services. So I think additionality, a couple of examples then. One is about extending bank branches in rural areas. So it's not doing it as opposed to not doing it at all, giving more lending to a bank, enabling them to bring out more bank branches, as well as mobile banking, of course, to rural branches is a good thing. Example 2, crowding in other investors, like with the climate fund, excellent. If you have, let's say, a pension fund sitting on billions and billions, not knowing and not feeling comfortable with how to actually deploy it and get it to work in emerging markets.
Okay, these are good examples. Are there any no-go areas where you say there the private investment is not a good tool?
Sin sectors. Sin sectors is not something that we do, and with sin, essentially tobacco, pornography, weapons, a couple of other sectors that really are not. So that's not okay.
Otherwise, feel free.
As for the rest, it's very hard to say generally for all countries or even all just developing countries that energy is always better for your people than hospital investments. You will always land with general conclusions like that. They're going to land wrong. You will have to understand the local and even sub-national level. What are the needs? Perhaps if hospitals are such a good and health interventions are so good to support, well, we have 4 hospitals already in the city. So perhaps we would need some more investments in education or in infrastructure or in other sectors. Or in manufacturing for that part, which is very labor intensive and creates lots of employment. So I think there are areas where you should not go, sin sectors, but in terms of the areas where you should go, you should really look at what's needed locally in society, where you can have the greatest impact, and that answer will always differ depending on where you're going.
Okay, give a hand to Niclas Johansson. Thank you very much. So Lars Koch, civil society, you're last now. More than 150 organizations from 5 continents gathered here. Why is financing for development summit also so important for civil society?
It's all about following the money. Now I think Ban Ki-moon, he said that we're the first generation who can end poverty. And we're the last generation who can act to avoid the worst consequences of the climate change. So we just have to act now. And the finance for development, as Camilla exactly pointed out, I mean, if we don't get a good compromise in Addis on the financing, we will face complicated negotiations further on in the year. So we have to get some compromise, and we have to look for some good compromise in that.
You have heard some of the answers. I'm sure you agree with some of them, but I know there's one disagreement to the gentleman next to you about the need for the intergovernmental body on tax. Why is it so important for civil society? Why don't you just say, well, the other approach of opening up OECD, maybe that's okay?
I think one thing to say is at least that we very much agree on the importance, and Denmark is taking a lead also with Nordic countries on strengthening capacity in countries to mobilize domestic resources. That is key. And I think it's also important, which we should not forget in these circles, the importance of also the governments of developing countries to do their part of this. They have a big step to move on. But I mean, on this, why we're critical about the model we have in OECD, I think to some extent you could compare the tax system we have with the 4T model. That is from 1930. The model 4T, which was one of the coming out of the assembly plants in the US. It was a great car by that time. But nowadays, it was invented at the same time as the international tax system we have today. They were also invented 80 years ago. And nowadays, I mean, you have a tax system which is still a kind of a 4T, and it tries to compare with, in a race with multinationals who are driving a brand new Ferrari, and it's fueled by tax advisors, and it has 60+ pit stops around the world in tax havens. I mean, it's the system we got on tax is just not fit for purpose today.
But if OECD is ready to make itself into a Lamborghini,
Yeah, it's a Lamborghini is maybe a good picture. That's often a two-seater. So, I mean, what we need is a kind of a double-decker luxury bus where you can fit in the entire world. I mean, we have to, when we're trying to make new rules on taxation, you have to have the participation of the countries who are comparatively most hard affected by the current system and the illicit financial flows which we are trying to combat. So, I mean, it's about participation of developing countries. You have to have them on board. You have to have an equal vote and equal footing in this decision making. And I think what we can do, and we should be aiming at, on the first step in ATIS, that is, we need an intergovernmental body, an interministerial roundtable on tax. And out of that, we've got to see the decision coming of an intergovernmental body later on after ATIS. But I mean, it's also about the content. This is about the process, participation, and voice. This is crucial. And if we don't get that voice, I doubt whether we'll get the compromise needed in ATIS to satisfy the demands of the developing countries, if we don't expect the developed countries donors come up with a huge chunk of ODA, and I don't think that is more realistic. So we have to get the compromise on tax, I believe. And the content of that is, I mean, it's not only about voice, it's also about this 4T model that we're driving, the current tax system. It allocates taxing rights to the rich countries' headquarters of the multinational, instead of allocating tax rights in developed countries. It focuses on digital economy of the rich countries. It doesn't focus on extractive industries. I mean, we're talking about in OECD, in automatic exchange of tax information, developing countries are excluded. I mean, we've got to get also the content of this car updated to a luxury bus where we all are on board and which is fit for purpose today.
Thank you very much, Lars Koch, and giving a hand to Camilla Brückner. From the UN point of view, and with your strong focus on the global goals in summit in September, we also heard about you talking about what would you wish could influence, after listening to Sweet Fund, the Danish minister, the Danish civil society. Do you think there will be some openings here for a success in ATIS, some pieces of advice from you, and say, concentrate on this?
Well, I briefly mentioned it earlier. I think, first of all, it's very important that the discussion doesn't center around ODA only, because ODA is such a small proportion of what needs to be found for achieving the SDGs. We're talking trillions. And so I think there has to be a very common understanding that ODA is very important for certain circumstances and for certain purposes, for seed funding, for creating pilots, for innovation, for the very poorest, the fragile states, etc., where the proportion of ODA is big. But certainly for lifting the whole SDG agenda, which is universal, it is a grain in the haystack. So I think if negotiators can really demonstrate that we are in a new world where we need some new mechanisms, where private sector needs to have frameworks where they feel it's worth investing, and you have the mechanisms and systems in place that they feel safe in investing, that you have tax systems that will ensure the mobilization of local resources, and that you combat illicit financing and also taxing from the extractive industry. So I think this is where the donors and the developed countries can show their commitment, that given that they are large players in these areas, that they are, as Lars said, committed to the bus, committed to help developing countries build their tax systems, and committed to help countries change their legal frameworks and build their capacities to create an investment environment that is worth for the private sector to invest. This is where the resources have to be shown as well, not just with the ODA. And if we get trapped into this very sort of poisonous and non-ending discussion about how much ODA, we missed the point. And so this is where I think the focus has to be in the coming weeks up to the meeting.
But also listening to Lars Koch, he maybe also admitted that maybe that battle is, well, that's not where the battlefield will be, but more or less on the tax. And do you feel the same or fear the same in the UN, that it will be on taxation or this intergovernmental or not discussion, which will...
I think the most important, whether you choose one mechanism or the other, is that it's inclusive. I mean, this is the point and the idea we have to convey, that this is a conversation that includes everyone and is relevant for everyone. So of course you should avoid mechanisms that exclude certain parts of the world. That's going to end.
And that's right now. That's how the system is right now. OECD excludes some parts of the world, right?
But there is also a global partnership conversation that is taking place that tries to include India, China, Brazil, and some other of the emerging economies, and also the rest of the developed world as well in this conversation. I have no position on whether a tax organization in one or the other framework is right, but whatever system comes up has to be one where everybody feels equal in terms of rights and vote. And that we don't have right now. That's true. And
the inclusiveness.
Yes, inclusiveness is absolutely essential.
Minister Johansson, do you think you'll be able to, with your colleagues in the EU and the rich world, to turn OECD into a more inclusive club?
Yes, I think so. I'm not at these meetings personally, but what I get back and the reports I get is that there is a will in order to open up this forum, and that is needed. You cannot address this agenda that we're talking about without opening up the OECD work on this, and also that developing countries have the same rights as developed countries when it comes to take part of the discussions and the decisions. And it's just, seen from my perspective, a lot of experience is built up within the OECD work. A lot of we have a great tool there, a great machine room, and it's easy just to say, okay, now we want to create another body somewhere else, and that would also be the easiest part to do. But I think that the most reasonable thing is to build on what we have, where we have a lot of also understanding with each other about how things work, how the mechanisms are, and therefore also, I think, a better possibility of changing things. And then use this and open it up so that we have the inclusiveness that I think we all agree upon. But I have to say also that if at the end this will be the path that will make everything be agreed upon in Addis, what kind of body we should use for the tax discussion, then I don't think that should be the big obstacle. If that's where it all ends, I just don't think that this is the thing that is so important that will decide whatever you get a good result or not. But I'm not, in a principle against a new body. I just don't think it's the best idea, the best way forward.
Thank you very much. I know you will unfortunately soon have to leave the stage.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But before, I would like at least to give a chance to, some of our visitors from the South, if there would be a question or two, particularly to you, Minister, because at least that we have that possibility. And I see running for a mic. And please, if you would introduce yourself and where you're from.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Alvin Musioma. I work with an organization called the Tax Justice Network Africa, based in Nairobi. Thank you, Mr. Johansson, for the submissions. I have a comment and a question, and the comment is that as the Southern African minister said once that if you're not on the table, then you're on the menu. So I think that the conversation about creating an inclusive structure which is representative, which is democratic. We cannot bypass that because the rules, the people that are setting up the rules now are the ones that are benefiting. As Lars was saying, we cannot move away from the debate about the need of establishing a new global systems, because the problem we are caught right now is what you have actually pointed out in your last statement, is that the systems that are existing that are more democratic are too weak, and those that are too effective don't have those, have democratic deficiencies. So how do we address that problem? And I think that that should be part of the priorities in IBIS. My question to you is that from the civil society perspective, there has been mainly 3 agendas that the civil society have been pushing, and I wanted to hear from you how the Danish government, that the Nordic countries in general see that. One is what you have addressed about the governance structures, which I feel you are a little bit pessimistic about. The second is the measures that would lead to increased transparency. There's been a lot of conversation about the need to new mechanism of country-by-country reporting, automatic exchange of information, beneficial ownership. So I'd want to hear your reaction on that. And from your submission, what will be the best results out of IBIS? At the end of IBIS, if you look at IBIS backward, what would you say if we were to have achieved this and this and this from our perspective? Would have had a successful summit. And lastly, the support that goes to developing countries. I know that there's been a lot of emphasis from a number of Nordic countries, but on the need for technical capacity building. So I would want you to expand a little bit more about how the Danish government sees the investment in capacity building of revenue authorities in developing countries.
Thank you very much. Number of questions, and please, Minister, if you have time to answer.
For the last thing first, we think it's of the utmost importance that we, as a part of our ODA, prioritizes a great amount of resources in order to help our partner countries, both increasing their capacity, technical capacity, in order to build up tax system and tax collection system. We have been doing that for now a number of years in several countries. I mentioned Tanzania, where we have had very good results. We're also working in Ghana now with setting up the same system. I think we are investing some around half a billion Danish kroner into different kind of support in our partner countries for this. But of course, we also support organizations like your own to work who can speak up for this and also provide us assistance on regional level to lifting this whole question. And recently, I also launched a plan where we would try to influence better the EU on making our policies coherent in the EU in order to work on this question. So I think we are working in a lot of areas in order to fulfill our aim on getting more domestic resource mobilization and also fighting tax evasion and illicit financial flows. And when it comes to the how far we will go when it comes to in the discussion on when it comes to the construction and change of construction of OECD, or how a new kind of body would look like, we are not yet in the detailed discussions on that, so I can't give you a detailed answer for that. But I can say that what we want when it comes to the Danish government is to have a process and a body taking care of this, where you have inclusion of the developing countries, of our partner countries. And I also think that is needed. You cannot do this job without doing so. And I'm sure also the OECD will see that. And I know that we are also funding that this can happen. So that's the way we want to go forward, and I agree that we cannot get further in this process without having a more inclusive process within the OECD.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you for sharing your time with us. And sorry you have to leave, but that was the conditions. Yeah.
Good conference.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Please warm up also with more questions and prepare and put a hand up if you have some issues. Until I see more hands from the floor, I'll just go back to you, Lars. The private sector's capital and technology transfers are, as we have heard from several the panelists, expected to play a critical role in the outcome from IBIS. How do you see the private sector as part of the solution, and do you share the same conclusion that they are needed?
Yeah.
Why?
No, I mean, we need the money. No, I mean, realistically, what we see, I mean, the recent OECD data on ODA were 0.3 or 0.29% of GNI for development aid. So I mean, ODA, we have to push on for that, and I think it's right also what the minister said here, that we have to push on for more aid for least developed countries. However, I mean, we also need other funding. That's where we come to the tax issue, and we come to the private sector. And leveraging private sector funding for development, I think that is, I mean, that can be a good strategy, but.
Yeah, that's why I thought that would be a but.
Lending aid, and we talk about leveraging private sector fund. I would like to call it leveraging development outcomes. I mean, we got to focus on not on leveraging more private sector investments, which are just investments where we don't know if there's any development outcome. We need results from these investments, which are tangible to poor people in the countries. I mean, it's not enough just to have, say, investment. We've been looking into a mining project in the northern Mozambique, where you have in Mozambique and other countries in Africa, a lot of growth, a lot of investments, no development results, no results on inequality, no results on poverty. And looking into this particularly mine, I mean, seeing that, I mean, with 5 development finance institutions, not the Sweat Fund, who are taking a lead on these issues, but other development finance institutions who've been financing this mine, and you cannot see any specific tangible results from this investment. And I mean, that's what we have to look at when we do this, when we have aid money which are earmarked for development, for poverty reduction, for reducing inequality. You have to have some specific results in the investments, and we've got to be better at that, focusing on that.
So that was the but concern. Niclas, can you follow that, and do you think there will be possibilities of kind of reducing that risk in the future?
Yeah, I mean,
maybe you take the ministers.
Is the private sector needed, if you agree with that? I think when you look at the number of jobs created and sustained in developing countries, the proportion of private sector jobs is much greater than it is in my native country, where it's kind of half-half. If you look at really poor countries, it's more like 9 out of 10 jobs. So if you only have 1/10 being the public sector working really hard for development outcomes, and they're driving in the 5th gear and everyone else is idling, you're not going to get anywhere. If you get all 10, even if they're only in the 1st gear, you're going to get twice as far. That's mathematically twice as far, right?
That sounds very nice, but what about the example with the mine in the northern?
With the mine is, as long as I think if they can find financing from other institutions, as in private investors, great. And if there is a regulatory supervision to make sure that working conditions are fine, which in some cases where DFIs invest, they're not, but we've set limits that are higher than the legal standards, and we help to improve. So then that's fine if you can get the private funding. If you can't, and provided that we all still continue to use cars and cell phones and everything else that needs resource extraction, then at least mining as an activity cannot shut down. The earth without mining doesn't exist. So it's about then doing it responsibly, sustainably. Question is that something for private investors or for publicly supported investors to do. We don't go into mines, and that's a deliberate choice. We've chosen 3 other sectors as our target sectors. We have chosen finance because a lot of people are deprived of affordable credit. If you have to pay 20-30% interest rate, you can't afford a house, you can't afford anything. Second, we provide a lot of investments in manufacturing because it's very labor intense, and there we can also provide a lot of technical know-how transfer in terms of health and safety standards, emissions, etc. And the third thing is energy, and that's more the non-income side rather than the income side of poverty. You can be as wealthy as you want, but if you have no electricity, it doesn't matter what you pay, there is none. So that's a great enabler for the rest of the economy. Schools, hospitals, factories, government, everyone needs electricity.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to the floor. Yeah, that's a question on the, I think, 6th row. Please introduce yourself before you put the question.
Hi, oh, that's very loud, isn't it? I'm Jesse from Eurodad. I wasn't going to say anything, but I can't not say anything, Niclas, when I hear the narrative you're presenting, which is presented to us again and again in this discussion. And not only is it wrong, I think it's extremely dangerous, because I think we have to have a balanced narrative on private investment. And that means recognizing not just that it can produce good outcomes, good jobs, good growth, but also that there's a negative side and there are huge risks as well. And so I think 3 things need to be borne in mind. First, most investment in developing countries, private investment, is domestic investment, over 30% of GDP, foreign investment less than 5% of GDP. Portraying foreign investment as the answer is wrong. The second is there are enormous risks. The South Centre has just produced a paper showing that almost all developing countries are now at risk of financial crisis because of the growth in foreign investment into those countries. So increasing foreign investment and portfolio flows in developing countries can make their financial systems very prone to risk. So we've seen what happens in the Asian financial crisis and other crises when flows of money come out very quickly. So there's a huge risk, which is, I think, probably the most important issue we should focus on. And thirdly, not all investment is brilliant. So manufacturing investment might be great, but we know that mining investment is 60 to 80% of investment in the least developed countries and produces 1 to 2% of employment. So it's got not such a huge beneficial impact on the local economy, but huge risks.
Thank you very much. Niclas, you want to respond?
Yeah, sure. I agree with all you said, and B, I don't see how it contradicts anything I said.
That was easy. Yeah, maybe is the neighbor, please.
Hi, I'm Mark from Allianz Süd in Switzerland. A question to Lars and another one to Camilla. It was interesting to hear that Denmark is one of the largest donors when it comes to capacity building for tax reforms and tax administrations. Ironically, Switzerland is another large donor. Our SECO assists developing countries in doing tax reforms and building up capacities for their tax administrations, which I guess shows that this is a nice way to sort of distract from the away from the actual problem, which is capital flight into Switzerland. What I'm really concerned with is that the capacity building and technical assistance to developing countries is not just technical assistance, it also has tax advice in it. And usually what Switzerland prioritizes is value-added taxes, consumers taxes, etc., that are totally regressive. Because they say, well, high income is hard to tax because it goes away, it goes into Switzerland anyway. So I was a bit surprised to hear that, Lars, you sort of congratulate Denmark on putting a lot of effort into that. Isn't there a need to really look into what kind of tax reforms and what kind of capacity building donors engage in? and see that this doesn't have any regressive consequences, but actually produces a more progressive tax system. And the other question is, we haven't talked about debt. In my understanding, there are like two make or break conditions for the financing for development negotiations. One is the tax organization. The other one is a debt resolution mechanism. And we need to have either both, or at least one of the two, in order to call this a good conference outcome. What's UNDP's stance on having a fair and transparent debt resolution mechanism? Hasn't been mentioned so far.
Thank you very much, Mark. Lars, would you like to start?
Please. Mark, I do agree with you that, I mean, we shouldn't be naive. We need to look at the systemic issues, and that's why we have to look at the tax system. But we shouldn't either be naive the other way around. There's a huge gap when we've been working in Sierra Leone particularly on mining and taxation of mining. I mean, they need a lot of help to strengthen their systems, to monitor what's going on at the mining sites, to strengthen their revenue authorities, to have more transparency internally in what happens to the revenues. And of course, the devil is in detail in the advice that Danida and other donors is providing. However, I mean, what we see is a change, at least. Well, I'm not sure exactly where Danida is. I'm pretty certain if they follow more or less the lines we have in Denmark, it is a relatively progressive tax system we are advising. But other actors in this field, which they also rely on, are increasingly IMF, who, to our surprise, increasingly is an ally in many of our countries where we're working. They're an ally in for an example, advising to break stability clauses on mines, so you can change the tax which is in the contract signed by the government and the mine. They're advised to break that. They're advised to raise corporate taxes. They're advised to end tax exemptions, and that's increasing the line we see. But I'm not sure all the way around. I agree with you. It's important what's in the advisory work. But I'll just underscore, and sometimes, well, closing down box one here, sometimes among us in civil society, we tend to forget the issues which are at stake in developing countries and their governments, and also be able to hold them to account for the problems that we face. And that's when you go and work, as we do in the mining sites in some of these countries, you realize it's pretty crucial also to work at that level.
Thank you very much, Lars. Camilla Brückner, that was a question to you and UNDP.
Well, I just want to also ask the gentleman from Eurodad who raised this risk factor. Of course, there's big risk, and we are very aware of that and agree, and we work alongside with private sector to look at how can we de-risk, or with countries, sorry, to de-risk investments. But, you know, that, I mean, are you then saying, I would like to ask back to you, that we shouldn't do any investments? I mean, I don't really see that alternative. So it's about improving I guess the rules and regulations that exist for foreign investment. And in the case of Mozambique, where I was just in recent months, it's all about already setting in with capacity development or capacity support in even going into the agreements, because that's where they lose out in the first place. This is where the companies have an army of lawyers from the best companies in the world, and they are sitting with very, very poor resources to counteract some of the demands that the companies are making. So it's already from that very start that they need help. They admit, you know, where there is only so far we can go. At the same in Zambia, where we had what was it called, the campaign? I can't remember. There was this film where the president openly admitted, yeah, we know we're being screwed, but we didn't have the capacity to make the deal right. But I also have to say I'm also optimistic, because we have conversations with some of the bigger companies, including companies like Anglo American, and they're slowly starting to realize that sucking out, you know, every penny from these countries is not a long-term sustainable solution for them either. They do plans on a 50 to 100-year span. And if their local communities slowly are deprived and dying out in the areas where they operate, it's not good for them either. So I think there is a starting change of understanding and appreciation of engaging with local community and benefiting the local community as well, creating the jobs that need to be there for the populations to stay. So we're at the beginning. I admit we're not in the best place, but we can see in the conversation we have with these companies definitely a slowly starting change of culture. On the debt issue, I mean, how can we not be in favor of a fair debt resolution mechanism? I mean, yeah. I don't know what to say.
But Camilla, do you think the UN guiding principles and the whole global compact system, which from civil society said that's too weak, it's too soft, it's too voluntary, can that be strengthened? Can that be a tool of that dialogue, getting in dialogue with the old enemies like Anglo-American, as you just said?
No, I think the global compact and the CSR framework was the beginning. It was a start that basically ignited the conversation and slowly has sensitized companies to not only responsible behavior, but what is important for them to also acknowledge is that in the end it'll come in as a benefit to them as well. I think that's the real end of the cycle we have to get to. We're only halfway there. The CSR framework is kind of the old thing and absolutely weak. But I think we have to, especially in the conversations here with the FfD, we have to include the private sector in the conversation so that they understand more and more what we are trying to do and get to a objective that will benefit both sides. Because in the end, that will benefit everybody. And the short-term quick gain is actually, and if it's damaging people in the process, then you will in the end also be damaged yourself as an investor. So it's that conversation we need to have. And I can see also at the World Economic Forum, which is dominated by these players, that is the rhetoric that is taking place now. The problem, I think, is that it's only the very big players who can afford to take that luxury at the moment, to take that extra step. The challenge is now to get the smaller and also local investors on board and work with us in that direction. So more, as I think it was you who said it in the beginning, invite more people around the dinner table. It's not an either or. We have to do this together.
Thank you.
I don't know what I'm doing here. Mine is on the private sector as well. I'm sitting on an advisory council advising the Danish minister. And for the last 2 meetings, we have been discussing the private sector and the linkages to development. And in the council, you have also representatives from enterprise and Danish industry and all that. And it's quite clear that when we, from the NGO side, when we say that we want a development outcome, we want sustainable development, etc., we have an issue where we need to translate things, not exactly to the people that are on the board on the same council, but to the industry and to the enterprises that we want to involve in development. It is development jargon, and we know it well, but we have to translate it. So when we're in the discussion, when I argue that, to me, we have, of course, a whole Christmas tree that we want to fill out with all the good things that we want private sector to do. But if we have to prioritize, my take would be to say, job creation for youth is the most important thing for developing countries. There can be other views on that, but to me, that will be the most important thing. And then when you present that argument, then Danish industry say, yeah, we can understand that, we can work with that. So I think that in the workshop and in the discussions, it would be good if part of the conversation could be to say, how can we translate what we would like to happen in terms of development outcomes into something tangible that can be understood by the enterprises that we want to involve. So a comment and a plea, I guess.
Thank you. Niclas, a suggestion from Van Berlesen now that it's focusing on job creation and in particular for youth. How does that fit with the Sweet Fund, for instance, your policies?
Well, it's job creation is at the center of what we do. At the same time as there are a lot of expectations and wishes, and all very fair, and I agree with them all, in terms of then also addressing climate change, in addressing gender matters, in addressing a whole string of other very relevant targets. So sometimes they coincide, sometimes we come to kind of forks in the road where you really have to choose, and that makes it a bit difficult. We have, though, as I said, chosen job creation as the kind of center of our efforts to reduce poverty. And the way we do it is by going to countries where poverty is relatively higher. So we are among the 15 European development finance institutions, the one with the largest share of our portfolio in Africa. And that's Africa, south of Sahara, sub-Saharan Africa, and not South Africa. So low-income and low-middle-income countries. We're not in Botswana either, for example, or Namibia for that part.
So job creation, you say that fits well, but then we all talk about also the need for getting youth jobs. Have you got that recipe right also?
We haven't gone down to the level of what age group should you target. It is, of course, so this is one area where a sustainable mindset goes hand in hand with a commercial mindset, in that you should have, we think at least, a meritocratic way of employing people. So you shouldn't really judge people by gender or ethnicity or color of their hair or anything else. And we think that that's something that we try to promote, but it's not one of the key efforts. Our key effort is really to go into very poor countries, into sectors that we think can create jobs and sustain a lot of jobs, and to help them manage their businesses really well in terms of safe working conditions, minimum wage, promote where we can female employment in leadership positions, etc.
Thank you.
So that's what we do.
Sir?
Thank you. My name is Gary Cuneo, and I'm with UNOPS. I can't help but compare IBIS with Monterrey in 2002 and how the global community has evolved. Today, we have maybe 33 countries that are LDCs and about 30 countries that are donor countries. You have 130 countries that are middle-income countries for which the whole ODA discussion may be, completely less relevant. We're going after $2 to $3 trillion, as Camelia has said, per year, compared to the 140 billion in ODA. I guess my question is, compared to the process and the outcomes of Monterrey, what needs to happen differently in IBIS in July so that we have the outcomes? What does success really look like at the end of IBIS? Is actually what I'm asking, considering the new global context and the lessons we've learned from the Monterrey and Doha experience.
I think that could go for all three of you. Lars?
Yeah, thank you.
How does the success in IBIS look like?
No, I think it's good to make the distinction that you're making, say there are different target groups, and the interesting thing is that we are looking at financing development for universal goals, also goals counting for Denmark or for Brazil or for other countries, which are, So I think it's good to make that distinction. And I think in that distinction, I see three success areas in IBIS, and that is on the ODA. We've got to get more and better ODA targeted more the least developed countries. I mean, that's where it really is needed. And the second thing, and the two, there are other elements, and I'll come to my mind all the things I should say. On the systemic issues, I mean, and that's on tax, it's on trade, it's on debt restructuring. The systemic issue, how we deal with the opportunities for the least developed and middle-income countries to mobilize funds, and that is affected by the tax system, the trade system, the debt system, and that's where the systemic discussions are crucial. I think that now the private sector, I also mentioned just that, because in some of the middle income countries, the private sector investments are much more important. We should, however, be careful that a lot of the DFIs like Swedfund and your sisters, they are investing in middle income countries. You say you are leading the pack on investing in less developed countries, but we also see most of the companies worked with through the DFIs are OECD-based countries, I mean hometown companies from the rich countries, which is not necessarily supporting the building of a local industry, a local economy, which rather is building the support of export base of OECD-based countries. So there are different elements, but the ODA is key for the least developed and systemic issues for the rest of it.
Thank you, Lars. Camilla, would you like to add something? The multilateral point of view?
Largely, I agree, and I think I mentioned it at the beginning, is that we get beyond the ODA, that it doesn't become about the ODA element, and rather focuses on these new sources of financing, which were not as prominent in Monterrey as they are today. And because the world has changed, the agenda we are standing toward, towards is a big integrated universal agenda that is about the whole global future. It's not just an introvert agenda as the MDGs were, where it was solving national problems primarily. Now we're talking about solving national and global problems. So it really has to be a global agreement that encompasses all flows of financing. And if we omit one or other, that would, to me, be less of a success. So as comprehensive as it can be, that would be our desire. I just want to come back to one quick anecdote of my previous point, because I'm sure that members from civil society here may not have believed what I said about the Anglo-American point, but I sat in a panel in the World Economic Forum with only extractive industry members, and there were no civil society there, okay? And this is Chatham House rules, so I won't mention any names, but there was one of the biggest mining companies in the world who said, how can we make a compact with the civil society actors, in a given context, and then just agree with them that we'd adhere to these rules, and then they'll leave us alone. We don't want to talk to them. So we have an agreement, and then they get off our back. And I can tell you, the rest of the group, and this was 25 CEOs from mining companies and extractive industries, they said, no, we want this conversation. We want to be hassled by civil society. They keep us on our toes. We cannot avoid that we'll have an accident that they will then address. And we need them to do this. So you see, there is definitely a change of attitude at that level, at least. So it has to trickle down. But that was just a side point. Sorry for that.
Niclas?
Just really brief.
Yeah, very brief. Yeah.
I think that's super interesting what you said there, because I was trying to say the same, not quite as eloquently perhaps earlier, but people providing perspective, if people provide you with criticism and with additional perspectives, it's because they want you to do better. And in essence, they want you to succeed in the long term. If you treat your employees better, if you treat the environment better, you're going to be more successful in the long run. So everyone's better off. And there is no business on a dead planet at the end of the day, really. So I think that's fine, and that's right. But talking about the big companies who are doing the right things and who are throwing resources on the problems because they have the resources and they have the exposure, leaving a lot of actors in between that are less resourced. I think it's not the lack of intent and good high ambitions and wish to contribute. It's the lack of the tools and the resources to do so. So I think the disagreement, or that what might seem as disagreement occasionally, is not about all wanting to contribute to an end state that is genuinely a good outcome for everyone. It's about how do we get there, what can we do, what are the practical, real measures that we can take. And that's why that feedback is so useful. Okay, we didn't know that, we didn't see that. Great, thank you so much. How can we do better?
So a big encouragement to all here to be on your toes. I saw suddenly a forest of hands. So I think we'll now, please, I would ask you kindly to shorten your questions. Then we will take 3 and you'll get around. And the last three also. I think I've got you all. Yes, please. And the gentleman in the orange, you will start.
Thank you. Oh, this is really hard. My name is Martin Hajek. I'm from the Action International, and my questions are primarily towards Niclas and about the operations on the Sweat Fund, because you basically position Sweat Fund as a very progressive institution. So I wonder what the policies are that you have within your investments and towards your partners you work with on the requirement for mandatory country-by-country reporting. Do you require the companies that you invest with to do voluntary by law, but under your rules, country-by-country reporting? What are the anti-avoidance measures, or how you secure the preference of the source taxation and avoid the use of tax havens? And then have more, but I'll keep it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Maybe you put it, yes, please.
I just have an important information, sorry for talking again. We talked about youth employment and how the private sector could promise that. In a week or so, a major Swiss corporation, along with dozens of other transnational corporations not from Switzerland, will launch an initiative on youth employment. It's timed quite well during the FfD negotiations because it will show that the private sector is already doing its parts, so there don't need to be any regulations, etc. But it also raises the question, like, if the private sector finds sexy topics such as youth employment, do they really need public funds? Do they really need ODA to go into this? Because public relations-wise, it's a very good initiative. They can show we're creating a lot of youth employment. They're expanding anyway. They're giving jobs to youth anyway, but they're going to start counting each and every job they create in the future and sell it as a unique selling point. What about education? How do we get the private sector to engage in education without mingling with the programs?
Thank you. And then the last question in front of you. Yes, please.
I just also want to add.
Who are you, sir?
So my name is David Ogala. I'm from Nigeria. I work for an NGO called ANEG, African Network for Environment and Economic Justice. My question is about the private sector. Just last week, there was a big company in Switzerland called Gleco, and they work in Zambia. We had a meeting with the CEO, and then I raised a question, and that question is exactly what I want to raise with you. If you are a company, you come into a country, and you know the country is corrupt. As a businessman, would you like to invest in such country? The reason why I'm asking this is that if the system is corrupt, the possibility for the country citizens to benefit from the private investment is slim. And that is what is majorly responsible for the outflow of resources. Which will your company continue to do business with the corrupt system, or you will not? In the case of Zambia, the CEO responded to say they don't see any corruption, even with the TI index, and they are doing business in that country. Thank you. So will your company do business in the country? Because the way it sounds, the companies that are coming to Africa, for instance, they are not charity organization. So the narrative that the companies are coming to help to create employment need to be guided and be placed in correct perspective, that they are coming to do business to also make money. So it's not a missionary work.
Thank you very much. So we have a question about country-by-country reporting, whether private sector needs ODA support, and finally here about transparency or corruption. And I suggest you just kind of pick what you want to address, not necessarily all three, we don't have time for that, and hopefully in the end there'll be three answers. Lascock, would you start?
Thanks. I'd like to start with the private sector and education you mentioned. I mean, that's one of my concerns. That is, to some extent, if we have private sector investments for profit, can we then ensure that will be for education, health, quality free for all, or will it always strengthen? It'll create more inequality? That's my concern, particularly in these sectors. And you see an increasing push for privatization of education and health system, where you see private sector coming in for profit. That is a real concern if you want to meet the human rights on education and health. That was one of the things I'd like to say. The other thing I'd just like to say, that is investing in corrupt countries, David. I mean, I think the private sector and also the investors, they have a responsibility. I mean, we have to deal with, like, take an example like Angola, where we know Angola is exporting more oil revenues than the entire sub-Saharan Africa get in ODA. I mean, what happens to these resources, the tax revenues they get? They don't benefit. I mean, 2/3 of the population in Angola are living below the poverty line. I mean, we have as Maersk, the Danish oil company, or the investors who are investing there, we have a responsibility for what's going on there, and we extract the resources with no benefit for poor people, and we have to question that one.
Thank you very much, Lars. Niclas, the cue to you will be then the responsibility is also on your shoulders as an investor about the corruption issue.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
I think, yeah, I agree definitely, and it's we cannot take a decision not to invest in a country purely on a basis of that it's got a very poor TI ranking. If there are destitute populations and areas and great needs and great poverty that has to be addressed, and where we find companies that we think could provide either the infrastructure or the health services or employment and economic inclusion and a better living standard in places, then we would want to explore that. If we find that we can identify and manage the risks, and we get that in the agreement with the company, we go on site visits, we check also through independent and sometimes secret investigators before the deals, which is kind of customary to do. If we find that we can do that, then that's great, because we actually lift the bar. Case in point, and just because case studies make things interesting.
And on the country-by-country reporting, I think you should add something there.
We do that, but it's very rare to do it in among the IFIs at this point. We do it since last year, and that report was actually nominated as one, or we were nominated as one of 16 funds out of a total of 1,195. Award ceremony in 2 weeks or 3 weeks in London. So that's great, even if we don't make it. At least we're among the 16.
But do you demand it from your partners also?
We do.
Okay.
So
so that's a beginning.
Yeah, it's a beginning, and it shouldn't be difficult. It really shouldn't, unless you have really poor figures to show, because then it's sensitive.
Do you have anything hot, Camilla, for?
Just quickly, I think that, yes, the private sector needs the ODA, more because the private sector, or the ODA, will address some of the issues that the private sector will not invest in, such as combating corruption, for instance. That is where the ODA can be useful. Or helping setting frameworks for better investment on a policy level. As the UN, we work closely with governments and trying to influence policy all the time. Interruptions they have in order to have guidance and information they need to make proper decisions. So I think they really do need this ODA in order to prepare themselves to be better players with the private sector and get more out of it. So there is definitely what do you call it? Different and compensate, no, not compensate, but supplementary roles for each. So one is not more important than the other, but they all play their role.
Thank you. I would like to ask permission for maybe taking 4 minutes of your break. And then the last 2 questions, unfortunately, no, sorry, but yeah, I have one for a long time here. First, you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Mokita Solomon. I'm from Zambia, actually in Zambia. I heard you've talked a lot about youth employment. And my concern is about a kind of employment which the private sector will create, given the situation in Zambia, like, especially in the extractive industries, where you find there's too much casualization, where workers maybe after 6 months are laid off. Afterwards, what next? because you are saying you are creating employment. Even the safety issues, when it comes to safety issues in the mining sector, are so pathetic, I can tell you, because my work here is in the extractive industries. Even maybe security guards, as at now you find they are being imported from the parent companies where they're coming from in their countries.
Thank you. Thank you. And then the gentleman with the glasses, yes?
Which one?
Oh, let's take both. you need to have glasses for have the last question.
Okay. My name is Fanuel Bokosi. I work for the African Forum on Network on Data and Development based in Zimbabwe. I wanted to make a few clarifications and probably a question. There was a notion in this room that after Monterey, the number of middle-income countries has actually increased. And therefore, one would think that ODA is not as important. I want to bring people to the reality that the preliminary OECD aid data for 2014 actually indicates that real ODA has actually increased to middle-income countries and decreased for real least developed countries. And Africa, I come from Africa, Africa is one of the major continents where these are. So the notion that because there are more middle-income countries, then ODA will be sufficient and suffice to go to least developed countries does not hold value when you look at the data because of the geopolitical elements of ODA. The second point that I want to make is that private sector is a very elusive argument, because again, if you look at where private foreign direct investment goes in the continent in Africa, it goes to the middle-income countries and not the least developed countries. So this idea that if ODA, which is actually increasing for middle-income countries, is used to leverage private direct investment, from the data that we have, one would assume that the conclusion is that it will leverage increased private sector investment in middle-income countries, where the trend is showing that ODA is actually in real terms increasing to middle-income countries, and that then leaves the question, what will happen to the least developed countries, especially in the continent like Africa?
Thank you very much. And then the last questions, colleague over there, and it should be very short, please.
Thank you. My name is Derek Jamter. I'm from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. I have, in the discussions of the last how many years, it appears that the private sector is discovered as a new actor in development process. And my question is it the private sector we know which has put us in the mess we are in today? Or is the private sector going to be reinvented? I say this question because actually we as Africans are trained to focus on our pickpockets and forget the big robbers. If you look at illicit financial flows from Africa, according to the last illicit financial flows report, 60% of illicit financial flows from Africa comes from the business sector. The corrupt African leaders in what? It adds up to the remaining 30%. The second one is, I think in the definition of corruption, we have to look at it. Facilitators, destinations, givers and takers of corruption. In Germany, for example, until a couple of years ago, companies can say, we paid this for corruption in Africa, and then they can deduct it from their tax liability. So in such a situation, and in fact, my brother asked, would you invest in a corrupt country? And all investors are in Switzerland. For me, the most corrupt country is Switzerland, because I think it is part of corruption. Attracting all corruption money in the world is corruption itself. Okay, final thing is,
thank you.
one last thing. If you look at the private sector, just go back in your own history in Europe, introducing the abolition of child labor. Did it stop because the private sector voluntarily did it, or it was stopped by legislation. 8 hours working day. How did it get introduced? There were some parts of the private sector who introduced it themselves, but it became effective after it was legislated. So in this sense, the primary purpose of the private sector is to pay taxes. It is the only corporate social responsibility accept. So, and this has to be enacted in an enforceable way for them to behave.
Thank you, sir. And I think there's much more for the break also and the following days, fortunately. But if you could just choose some of these last 3 questions or 3 rounds as also as your final contribution for this session. Lars Koch, would you start?
Yeah, there's a lot of things I would like to comment on.
But you can't.
No, I won't.
You have to pick.
No. I think it's important to look at the private sector to say, yes, the private sector on the one hand plays a key role in illicit financial flows, and it is often a part also of corruption, particularly when you look at oil and mining industry in Africa. It's the most corrupt sector we know of. On the other hand, I believe that, as you say, private sector is generating jobs, generating growth, and we need it, but we need to do it better. And I believe that we have to do it through regulation, we have to do it through better systems, but we also have to work on with the good guys among the sectors who are the leaders of the pack, who can take the steps towards also having regulation, when I believe in CSR as a means towards raising the bars for how we ensure that private sector also contributes stronger to development.
Thank you very much. Sweet fun, and Niclas doing?
Yep. About mining sector and trade-offs, I've been to mines on 4 continents, both underground and above ground, and I agree with you that the working conditions are such that most of us in this room, if not all, wouldn't dream of even staying for a full working day there. If we go into only perfect investments, then we don't add any value. It looks good if there are no problems and if we have 0 emissions in our portfolio, but on the other hand, how much can we improve them? None. So going into companies and improving is essential. As I said earlier, we're not invested in mining because we have a stronger belief in other sectors, but other DFIs are, and I can't answer for them. We choose to work in other sectors. So and since I have a poor memory, I have to write everything down. So we're back here. Here's my memory.
The final point, Niclas?
On low-income countries and LMICs and others, I think it's at least for us, we're fortunate to be able not to treat a country as one whole. We look at each individual company and the community in which it operates and how it contributes or renders increased risk to that community. So we can treat each individually, and that's of course a much easier situation in which to be. If we were to take a countrywide look at it, then I think a Gini coefficient would be a sobering complementary indicator. So basically the income distribution across the population, and I think that changes one's perspective on how LMICs and LICs and LDCs look. So I think that's really important to also put into the analysis.
Thank you very much, Camilla Brückner.
Yeah, I actually want to take the conversation to a completely different place, because we are very focused on the private sector and whether they're good or evil, and I think we agree they are essentially a necessary good. Maybe sometimes they're evil, but we have to raise the bar, and you do that incrementally. But what I want to say is that every year the UND produces the Human Development Report, and in recent years we've looked especially on the transformation that has happened over a longer term period, like 30 years, and we were looking at what are the key elements that have made some countries improve their human development significantly more than other countries. Because that's interesting to look at. Why are 10 countries accelerating more than everybody else? They were all countries have essentially improved their human development. Everybody except for maybe 2 countries are going up the curve. But the 10 countries who did better, they had deliberately had a long-term plan. They stuck to the plan. They invested heavily in social protection. They invested heavily in education. They invested heavily in health, and less in military. So I just want to put that in as a final remark, because in the end, the responsibility also lies in the countries themselves. And I include the developed world, because we certainly in Denmark, here where we are today, have very significant problems on certain issues that need to be solved as well. And it is about setting a target and following it and investing in the right means and instruments to get there. And for that, civil society is extremely important, as you heard also from the story about the mining companies. And they actually booed this guy out, okay? So just want to say.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for this last advice. And thank you all to all of you, Lars Koch, Niclas Døring, Camilla Brückner. And for all the great questions and comments from the floor, my only task now is to say that you should be back in the workshop at 4 o'clock. And if you haven't signed up for one, please do so.
In the plenary.
In the plenary here.
But you have to sign up for workshops.
And you also have to sign up for workshops. And I don't know if you go out for fresh air or some refreshment. Anyway, thank you for now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. It's good.